Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 121, Long Branch, Kologi Murder Trial. War Baby here with another episode of Murderous Minors. This is the conclusion to the Kologi family murders case out of Long Branch, New Jersey. For part 1, please see episode 115, Long Branch. After spending 4 years and 1 month in the Middlesex County Juvenile Detention Center in North Brunswick, New Jersey, Scott Kologi, now 20 years old, has finally gone to trial. I streamed the trial live on NJ Courts, and local news outlet the Asbury Park Press provided extensive coverage of the, quote, Long Branch murders, making it possible for me to share developments with you. If you'll recall, 16-year-old Scott Kologi spent New Year's Eve night 2017 with his family, his parents, grandparents, siblings, aunt and uncle, and his brother's girlfriend. The family ate dinner and watched the movie King Kong together downstairs, which ended at around 11:30 p.m. According to the defense's closing argument, Linda Kologi sent Scott upstairs to complete a project for school on floral arrangements so he could present it to the family after they counted down to midnight in 2018. Instead, Kologi was arrested on New Year's Day 2018 in the shooting spree that killed his 44-year-old mother Linda, his 42-year-old father Stephen Sr., his 18-year-old sister Brittany, and his grandfather's longtime companion Mary Shulz, who was 70 years old. His grandfather, aunt, uncle, older brother, and girlfriend were not shot. Kologi's family told doctors and later the police that the teen had a flat affect, lacked emotion, specifically empathy, and didn't comprehend the concept of consequences. His family preferred to blame a benign brain abnormality diagnosed years ago that they believed was still an active tumor. Psychologist Maureen R. Santina interviewed Kologi as a defense expert witness, and she testified that he was acutely psychotic when he killed his family members and that he was in the early stages of schizophrenia. To rebut her findings, the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office hired high-profile forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz to be their expert witness in April 2018. He's actually world famous, having consulted on or testified in numerous high-profile cases, starting with the attempted murder trial of John Hinckley Jr., who tried to assassinate President Reagan in 1981. He missed the president, but shot and paralyzed Press Secretary James Brady instead, spawning the 1993 Brady Act, often called the Brady Bill, which began the process of FBI background checks being required to purchase a firearm. Dietz testified for 5 days in the Hinckley trial, saying that he wasn't insane, but that he'd told him that he tried to kill the president to impress the young actor Jodie Foster. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity anyway, but the whole Jodie Foster angle made Dr. Dietz a well-known name. He was the prosecution's expert witness in Jeffrey Dahmer's murder trial and spoke to him for 18 hours in preparation for his evaluation and testimony. Dietz testified that Dahmer was not legally insane or psychotic when he killed, dismembered, and engaged in cannibalism, diagnosing him instead as a sexual deviant. Dietz wrote a report telling the FBI that continuing to negotiate with Branch Davidian leader David Koresh in 1993 Waco, Texas, wouldn't stop him from continuing to abuse the children there, but Attorney General Janet Reno ordered a siege by the ATF instead, and we all know how that went. Dietz consulted on Unabomber Ted Kaczynski's case, stating that he wasn't psychotic, and he also worked extensively with Richard Kuklinski, the famous hitman known as the Iceman, even starring in his third documentary. He'd said that Andrea Yates wasn't legally insane under Texas law when she drowned her 5 kids, claiming she had gotten the idea from an episode of Law and Order that didn't exist, causing her conviction to be reversed on appeal. He later admitted he made a, quote, honest mistake. He consulted on the Menendez brothers' case as well as Betty Broderick's, who murdered her ex-husband and his new wife after a tumultuous divorce. Dietz was the U.S. Attorney's Office rebuttal expert in the Boston Marathon bombings case, for which Dzhokhar Sarnev's death penalty was just reinstated. He was asked to be an expert witness in the O.J. Simpson case but said no, and went on to be hired by the victims' families in their civil suit. Most recently, he was hired by Ghislaine Maxwell's defense team. Scott Kologi, charged as an adult with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and the prosecution hoped that Dr. Dietz's testimony would help prove he was indeed sane when he committed the murders. Opening statements took place on February 9, 2022, after a delay of 10 days due to scheduling issues with the court. The jury also watched roughly 10 minutes of body cam footage depicting Kologi's expletive-filled arrest and officers searching the home and securing the rifle. For the prosecution, Rafaela Bontempo, the then-girlfriend of Kologi's older brother Stephen Jr., took the stand first, and he later. She described Linda Kologi handing out favors as midnight approached back on December 31, 2017. Just after Linda headed up the stairs to get Scott so that they could all watch the ball drop together, Rafaela testified that she heard a pop and some of them downstairs recognized the sound as a gunshot. Then, Rafaela said that she heard more pops and saw bullets come down through the ceiling. Everyone downstairs started scrambling, including Scott's sister Brittany, grandfather Adrian, brother Stephen Jr., and aunt and uncle Richard and Michelle Molyneux. Stephen Sr. ran upstairs, but Stephen Jr. testified that he stayed by the front door and heard more gunshots. His brother Scott came down the stairs casually, wearing last year's Terminator Halloween costume, Stephen Jr.'s rifle at hip level. Without raising it, his brother testified that Scott walked past him, through the living room and into the kitchen, and shot where Mary was, before shooting their sister Brittany 3 times, causing her to fall to the floor. He saw his grandfather holding up his hands before running from the house as Scott turned toward him with the rifle still at his hip. The jury heard him on the 911 call hysterically trying to explain that his brother had gotten a hold of his rifle and was shooting it, saying, quote, "He's shooting my family right now. He's still up there. His name is Scott." His girlfriend Rafaela was still in the house, huddled in the corner of the kitchen by the refrigerator, having called 911 as well. She had to whisper because Scott was in the kitchen with her and had just shot Mary and Brittany. She told the dispatcher to just hurry up. He'd already fired a total of 14 shots, but had started the spree with 2 full magazines holding 30 rounds each. On February 10, 2022, Kologi's aunt Michelle Molyneux testified that while setting up the board game Clue in October 2017, the teen had picked up the little gun game piece, pointed it at her and her husband, and said he was going to kill them and then go upstairs and kill his parents. She told police the day after the murders that a couple of times when he would say things like this, she would interject and ask if she would be spared, to which Kologi replied, quote, "No, of course I would take you out, but I would let Richie go home to his family." His mother had once replied, quote, "You wouldn't hurt me," to which he replied, quote, "I have to." And then Dad would be second because he would be sad without Mom. He added that he hated his sister Brittany and that Stephen Jr. would also have to be killed because otherwise he'd be left without parents. When Molyneux had found out that there was an unsecured rifle and ammunition in the home, she told her sister that she needed to confront her son's problems, telling investigators that, quote, "It was getting harder to keep quiet. I was scared because at that point I knew that there was a gun in the house, and I told Richie that I knew it was really going to happen." That's when her sister barred her from talking to anyone about her son, saying she would kick her and her husband out of the basement apartment if she didn't comply. It was only after she was sure her sister was dead that Molyneux even told police about Scott Kologi's disturbing past behavior. He'd say things like, quote, "He didn't want to hurt anybody, but he said someday he might have to." Kologi's aunt described a ritual of sorts they had where every Friday she would ride in the back seat while her sister Linda drove Scott to the Hawkswood School, after which the pair would go grocery shopping. Molyneux described countless conversations revolving around her nephew's thoughts of killing his family. He would tell his mother that the thoughts were getting worse and that he wanted to speak to his therapist or school counselor, but Linda would tell him that he'd be taken to the, quote, loony bin or be forced to take medication. Kologi said he wouldn't mind because the thoughts were getting worse. Molyneux testified that she tried to convince Linda that this was going to happen, but said her concerns were simply brushed off, with Linda telling her, quote, "You never know what'll happen if you say anything. Not only will you be put out, but you'll never see my kids again. Linda made it very clear to me that I would not have a place to live and she would never talk to me again." Regarding the gun, Stephen Kologi Jr. testified that it was with his legally purchased weapon that his brother killed their family members. He said that it had begun to rust in his old safe and that he'd planned on getting a new one after the holidays. Until then, he was just keeping it in its case in the bedroom he sometimes shared with Scott. The rest of the time, Scott slept in his parents' bed right in between them. Friday, February 11th, 2022 saw the jury viewing Kologi's police interview and the testimony of one of the detectives who conducted the interrogation, who said, quote, "He knew who he was shooting. He referred to them as his mother, his father, his grandmother Mary, and his sister Brittany. He shot his mother. He shot his father when his father came upstairs. He shot his grandmother and then he shot his sister. He said he was nervous as he was loading the magazines." A lieutenant that was one of the detectives who interviewed Kologi just after the murders testified that the then 16-year-old did describe seeing things and hearing things when he was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, but said he denied that he had heard voices prior to shooting his family. He told her that, quote, "When everything was happening, I felt like I was watching it, like I was further back in my mind. I was doing it, but I felt like it wasn't me." He told her he was, quote, "all over the place, but at that point I was kind of gone mentally. It's all scrambled." The following week, Kologi's older half-brother Jonathan Ruiz testified about what his brother was like and the night of the murders. He testified that even though Stephen Kologi Sr. wasn't his biological father, he'd grown up with the man and loved him as a dad. Close and fun was how he described his family, saying that they spent a good deal of time together, going to the beach, playing basketball in their yard, watching movies and playing games, breaking down as he said, quote, "Family is the most important thing in the world." He still visited at least once a week. He was 10 when his youngest brother was born and testified that he realized when Kologi was a toddler that he seemed behind developmentally, testifying that, quote, "He acted as if he was at a much younger age." Instead of catching up with his age group over time, the difference grew larger as he aged until, as Ruiz testified, quote, "There was a great disparity in his mental abilities." And even at 16, he testified, Kologi, quote, "had the palate of a child and only ate specific meals." He described how his younger brother slept with their parents in their bed and was still dressed by his mother, adding that he knew for a fact that the teen still believed in Santa Claus on New Year's Eve 2017 because Ruiz himself had engaged in the ruse, helping to hide presents labeled "From Santa." Everyone had seemed happy before he left to attend a party at a friend's house, he said, stating that, quote, Scott seemed normal. Local treating psychologist Maureen Santina testified for the defense the following day, on February 16th. She was court-appointed to evaluate Kologi and was later retained as the defense's expert witness because she was already involved in the case. Santina testified that Kologi said that in the days leading up to the shootings, quote, he was laying in bed and he looked to the side and saw a woman laying there that initially appeared human, but then her eyes turned red and she developed long, sharp teeth and then turned black as if she was being burned up. He'd told Santina that he'd woken up on New Year's Eve 2017 feeling like, quote, something was off, and saying that he took a shower to shake off the feeling, but while in there heard a voice telling him, quote, welcome to the side of evil. Santina told the court that Kologi had, quote, increasing indication of mental illness over several months. On that day, in my professional opinion, it was reaching a head. In my opinion, during the time preceding the incident, he was showing evidence of psychotic symptoms, schizophrenic symptoms. Things were starting to feel unreal to him. They didn't make sense from a rational standpoint. Those feelings were intensifying in the 2 to 3 months prior to the incident. Santina described him as being in a dissociative state and, quote, out of reality, saying that it would be, quote, inconceivable that Kologi could describe such an experience if it didn't occur due to his developmental delays. She testified that, quote, a person in a dissociative state can engage in organized behavior even though their mental state is disorganized. Although she acknowledged that in the weeks prior to the murders, Kologi had researched the difference between mass murderers and serial killers, Santina also said that he didn't realize that shooting his family members was wrong. She testified that, quote, at the time of the incident, Scott Kologi was laboring under the mental disease of schizophrenia, early onset schizophrenia, and also was actively in a psychotic state and a dissociative state. It's my opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty that Scott Kologi was not capable of understanding the nature of his actions or to understand their wrongfulness at the time he was engaging in the offense. During the defense's cross-examination, parts of Kologi's interrogation were played where the detective asked him if he knew shooting his family was wrong, to which he had replied yes. Murderous Minors is sponsored by Best Fiends. I really wish there were more hours in the day to work, clean the house, plan meals, and make sure everything is running smoothly, but honestly, it's just so I can have more time to play Best Fiends, the free-to-download mobile puzzle game that always leaves me wanting more. More adorable characters and fiends, more puzzles to solve, and more endlessly fun levels and events with more added all the time. You really can play anywhere, in line at the bank, in the dentist's waiting room, or waiting in the school pickup line. Best Fiends is the perfect casual match 3 puzzle game to make you wish you had longer to wait. I'm currently on level 832 and have been loving the story time challenges and great in-game prizes. Sometimes you just need a minute free from all the drama, and after all these years, I'm still obsessed and love when I can just lose myself in Best Fiends. If you haven't tried Best Fiends yet, what are you waiting for? Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. When Dr. Park Dietz took the stand to rebut the insanity defense, a great deal of the first day of his testimony centered on his professional details. He said that following his error in the Andrea Yates case, he offered to retake the stand to correct himself, but it was too late. He also testified that when filming the documentary for HBO with Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, he told producers that the infamous hitman had been lying to him, but they continued with the project regardless. Dietz didn't interview anyone other than Scott Kologi, relying on interviews with the surviving family members that were conducted by others. The California-based doctor was hired by the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office, then saw Kologi for the first time several years after he became the state's expert witness. His bill is estimated to be roughly $200,000, while Santina reportedly earned less than $2,000 for her work on the case. When the questions finally turned toward Kologi, Dr. Dietz was adamant that in the years between the shootings and his meetings with the experts, the teen most likely devised hearing the evil voice as a coping mechanism. Dietz testified that, "I do think that he's protecting himself from a recognition of the terrible things he's done by adopting an explanation in which, somehow, mental illness did this to him. It's important to him to be able to live with what he's done, and if he can blame it on mental illness, that's easier on him than taking responsibility for it." Dr. Dietz's testimony revealed that Stephen Jr. had texted their mother, Linda, quote, "Grandpa says all Scott talks about is killing people," and that Kologi searched online about whether assault rifle rounds would pierce the bulletproof vests that police would be wearing when they responded. He had contradictory thoughts as compared to Santina, and he testified that, quote, "I reached the opinion that at the time the defendant was preparing for these events, the time leading up to these events, the defendant was capable of deliberating. In my opinion, during the time of the shooting, the defendant did know and appreciate the nature and quality of his actions. He's planning, he's preparing, and he's even anticipating a law enforcement response, which of course would only be if what he's planning to do is a crime, which means he knows it's wrong." Dr. Dietz did diagnose Kologi as being on the autism spectrum, saying that he was high-functioning, but did not diagnose the now 20-year-old as schizophrenic, calling his brief hallucinations more indicative of someone with autism. The doctor pointed out that no healthcare professional has found it necessary to prescribe antipsychotic medications over the past 4 years that Kologi has been under surveillance while incarcerated. He did concur with Santina, though, saying that, quote, "At least for a period of time on the date of the incident, the defendant entered a kind of dissociative state of depersonalization," going on to say that this is not solely attributable to those with mental illness. Dissociative states can follow trauma or the infliction of physical pain or deeply uncomfortable situations. He also pointed to the evolving stories that Kologi has told since the murders, testifying that, quote, "By the time he's speaking to Dr. Santina and me, he's saying that someone, either his family or others, are going to hurt him, but until then, he was going to hurt other people." The very first telling is the most accurate, and later tellings, for a variety of reasons, are less accurate. If he heard a voice that day, he should have told police, and he would have told police. Hours after the incident, he tells the police he was tired of it, and everything was coming together, and enough was enough. There is no mention about people now trying to hurt him. So when years later he reports having had psychotic symptoms on the day of the shooting, I don't believe it. What has not changed is that he thought about harming or killing people for a very long time before the incident. He experienced a buildup of tension that he wanted to be done with. The reason this is significant in my view is this collection of grievances or injustices underlies some very dramatic, significant crimes. People who collect injustices, who collect grievances, may have tension built up about that they release through completely unexpected criminal conduct, and that's what I think happened here. Dietz determined that Kologi was sane when he killed his family members. On Wednesday, February 23, 2022, closing arguments began. The defense began with, quote, "This tragedy was not born from wickedness. This tragedy was born from sickness. Scott was born with a mental illness, and it was born into his brain. It chose to be born into his brain." He then asked Kologi to rise and join him up front and told the jury, quote, "This is Scott Kologi, and he was born with a mental illness. And his family, they ignored his mental illness, mainly because of Mom, because she didn't want him to get taken away. We know that. And it wasn't out of her bad feelings or bad thoughts. She was doing it out of protection. She loved Scott, and she wanted to protect him from the bad things that can happen when people are stigmatized with mental illness or are taken away. So this family made a decision to ignore that mental illness. And because of ignoring that mental illness, this tragedy happened. Because Scott's mental illness was ignored, this tragedy happened. And they want you to ignore it again. And if we ignore it again, another tragedy will happen to this family, and this family's had enough tragedy." Lamuro went on to say, quote, "Scott Kologi is not bad. He is not evil. He's sick. How do we know? How did we learn through this trial that Scott was sick? We learned it from the people who knew Scott best, his family. Not 30,000 pages of documents and people who didn't know Scott, from his family." Lamuro points to the prosecution referring to his client's, quote, "wickedness." Like I said, that's this case. They say wickedness, we say sickness, that's this case. They never knew this family, they don't know this family now. Lamuro also accused them of being dishonest of how they portrayed Kologi at school, saying that a witness, quote, "acted like he was the valedictorian of some sophisticated school, misleading, flourished at a school with kids with multiple disabilities. Is that really fair to say?" He went on to claim that the prosecution didn't talk about certain facts, such as, quote, part of Scott's career building was to get him to go to a store with the correct amount of money to buy items. He was never going to be a psychologist. That's a fake story. Scott is not who they are painting him to be. Lamuro rallied against Park Dietz, saying, quote, "His fake story in the Yates case put a woman on death row, but he paid his own way to get back. He flew back to try and correct the record. It was too late. She was sentenced to death. A 3-judge panel threw that case out, sent it back, and what happened? She was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The court said that Dr. Dietz's false testimony could have affected the jury. He hasn't treated a sick patient in 30 years, only does paid evaluations. Make no mistake about it, folks, Dr. Dietz is a great storyteller, right? But he is not a truth teller, and we know it." When it was the prosecutor's turn, Assistant Monmouth County Prosecutor Sean Brennan said in part, quote, "How many times did we hear some variation of, 'Scott believes in Santa Claus'? How many times? I lost count. I stopped counting. How does that fact tell you anything, if it is in fact true? What does that fact tell you about the choices the defendant made that night? Does it tell you anything about them, or was it designed to elicit some type of sympathy?" Regarding sleeping in his parents' bed, Brennan went on to say, quote, "Was it every night? Was it some nights? Testimony varied. How many times was that brought up during the course of the trial? How many times was that brought up in summation? Why? Does it tell you anything about schizophrenia? Does it tell you anything about the mental health defense they're raising? Does it tell you any fact about the choices the defendant made that night? No. If it was so gosh darn important, why didn't they ask Dr. Santina about it? She testified for days. Did they ask her one question about the medical significance of that? The psychiatric or psychological significance of that? No, because there is no significance to it. Yes, as we see, Scott has autism spectrum disorder and he has attachments. Does that say anything about his choices? How many times did you see a picture of the bed? 5, 6, 7? Why? So that you could have the image in your head, a suggestion of someone who's small, who still believes in Santa Claus, as opposed to looking at the defendant in whole, all of what he said and all of what he did. He was aware of what he was doing. He was responsible for the choices that he made. The following day, on Thursday, February 24th, 2022, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before finding Scott Kologi guilty on 4 counts of murder and 1 count of second-degree possessing a weapon for an unlawful purpose. Following the verdict, Defense attorney Richard Lamuro stated that, quote, "This is a case that needed to be tried, and a jury needed to make this case a lesson about mental health, gun safety, and open minds." Lamuro stated that Kologi is likely to appeal his convictions, with the admissibility of his videotaped police interview a guaranteed focus. Prosecutor Lori Linsky said that, quote, "This trial hinged on issues of mental health and the responsibility of this defendant. The jury's verdict confirms that Scott Kologi was responsible for his decisions and actions on the night that culminated with him killing 4 members of his family. In recognizing the criminality of the defendant's actions, we also recognize that this is a tragedy for all of the family members who are left to mourn this tremendous loss." Mary Shulz's estate filed a civil suit against Scott Kologi and the estates of his parents, along with Stephen Jr. for leaving his weapon unsecured, though an appeal to his criminal conviction would keep the suit in limbo, where it's been since it was filed in 2018. The family home had been in foreclosure for several months at the time of the murders and was eventually sold off at a loss, making an all-state insurance policy the only probable way this suit would pay out. Allstate is disputing their responsibility to cover the intentional crime, even though the perpetrator is a, quote, "insured person that lacks the mental capacity to govern his or her own conduct." They filed suit against Scott, Stephen Jr., and the estates of their parents, hoping it results in not having to pay out on the Shulz's suit. Kologi is facing 4 life sentences in prison, and his sentencing is scheduled for June 30th, 2022. Kologi's Aunt Michelle Molyneux has regularly visited her nephew and spoken to him by phone, often searching for a simple why. Once she was confident that her misfired joke didn't prompt the spree, she wanted answers, but Kologi told her that she'd have to wait and read all about it in his book, which he told her is tentatively titled Scot Free.